Hello and welcome to today's webinar. It's one we're really excited about. Where should a CDP fit in your stack? This is Scott Dill with Real Story Group, and our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, is on with us as well, as you can see here on your screen. Tony's going to take us through the heart of today's presentation, but I just wanted to kick things off with a couple of housekeeping items of note here as we get started. First, we see a lot of new folks on the line today, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us. And as always, want to send a special thank you to our subscribers who are participating in today's discussion. For our subscribers, you'll be able to access a recording of this presentation in your subscriber library. And then for the other attendees, you will get a copy of the slides from our marketing team later this week, so keep an eye out for that. Also, we've got about 30 minutes here pegged for this presentation, and we will have some time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions or feedback that you'd like to share, certainly you can enter those questions into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. As we get started, just wanted to provide a real snapshot here of the markets we cover as an analyst firm. Real Story Group, we've been around for about 20 years now, and got our start with the blue line here on our famous subway map and web content management. Since then, we've added some additional subway lines, so to speak, here, areas such as digital asset management and marketing automation. But today we're going to focus on what's really one of the hot topics for our customers over the past couple of years, which is the orange line that Tony has circled there, customer data platforms. We evaluate about 30 vendors in this space, and what Tony's going to talk about today is where does a CDP fit in your overall MarTech or omnichannel technology stack. So with that, I'll hand things over to you, Tony.
Great. Thanks, Scott. I really love this topic today. Where should a CDP fit in your broader stack? I would say it's over the course of the spring and summer, it's been probably the #1 inquiry that we're getting from our clients and subscribers, which is, where does a CDP fit in among all of these other, this whole panoply of tools that I have? And I think it's actually a sign of progress. One of the things I'm going to be talking about is this whole idea of CDP 1.0 versus 2.0. And 1.0 was sort of like, do I need one or not? And, that's still an important question. But CDP 2.0, we're asking a more sophisticated and more arguably, more meaningful question, which is, okay, if I do need a CDP, where exactly should it fit? It's not a simple question always to answer, but I'm going to give you a framework for thinking about it today that we've been evolving at Real Story Group over the last year or so. So we always have to kind of fit this into the context of your broader MarTech and customer engagement stack, because we're talking about a stack here. So to that extent, we need a model for what this stack is. And in particular, we'll argue that there's a particular model, a specific model that you ought to be thinking about and really working towards for the 2020s. So to set the context here, obviously, for ideal customer engagement, you want the right content and message to the right person in the right context at the right time, and then measure it, right? And to be able to do that within various channels where you're contextualizing and assembling these experiences. Obviously, the thing that we're really concerned about today, and what is, I think, foremost in your mind for most of you, is this orange part, get it to the right person. This is the ideal. Unfortunately, for most of you, this is the reality, that you have this silo problem, that your content, your data, your rules, your planning, your analytics, your operations, everything are all bound or stuck within that particular channel. And so what this means is potentially really isolated and disjointed customer and prospect experiences across these channels, and a lot of difficulty that you're having trying to do this many-to-many integration. It's really not working well. So we believe that, structurally, with respect to your architecture, the answer to this is to extract certain services and capabilities from these engagement silos and address them at an enterprise-wide level, right? And so there's obviously omnichannel operations, journey orchestration in purple, omnichannel content in red, and customer intelligence and data management in blue. We'll talk about that later, but the obviously the table stakes here is being able to have unified customer data. And so for many of you, this was your first kind of stab at this in terms of trying to abstract a service or a set of capabilities, in this case, even a set of data from these individualized channels and manage it in a centralized, unified place at the enterprise so that you could leverage this kind of common view of the customer. And we've also argued that, all other things being equal, this ought to be a top priority for you. So that's why many of you have, invested in CDPs. If we're talking about a stack architecture, this is our target reference model for the 2020s. When we say reference model, this doesn't mean that this exists necessarily in the real world, although many of you are working towards this. This is really something that you would adapt for your own needs. But you can see at the top, you've got various engagement channels, more getting added all the time, a variety of different interaction delivery environments that may depend on the type of enterprise you are. And then we all need to deploy effective content and engagement management platforms. And what we've been doing over the last decade is really trying to modernize this particular tier here that you see in the first set of colors, and with varying degrees of success. But we think that the real push, the real emphasis for the 2020s is building out this last bottom tier of capabilities enterprise-wide, which we call enterprise foundation platforms. And so customer data platforms being just one element of that strategy, but arguably for many of you, really kind of a table stakes kind of capability. So this is the reference model that we're going to use for today as we talk about where should a CDP fit. So the first answer to that question is it should ideally be an enterprise-wide capability that can live underneath all of your content and engagement, or at least most of your content and engagement management platforms as an enterprise service. So that's a very generic answer. I think you probably are looking for something a little bit more specific. So let's dig into the details a little bit here. And the first prism we're going to look at this is what we think is kind of a fundamental evolution that we're seeing with respect to CDPs. And it's really something that we've seen in other marketplaces. And the short answer is it's a kind of a maturation of approach that for the first 5 years, there was a certain kind of hype around this. And now we're settling in and sort of looking at this and saying, okay, what do we actually want to do with these CDPs? And have we bought or would, what is it that we really need as opposed to what is it that the marketplace might tell us that they think we need? So we look at this in terms of these kind of two phases. So you had CDP phase one, which was really kind of the previous 5 years where these platforms are just getting launched, a lot of excitement around it, some early adoption, including among some people on this call today. And then what we call is the kind of new CDP 2.0 phase, which has really just kind of begun, we think, this year, and is going to be really the questions that are going to be answered over the next 5 years. So, in CDP 1.0, a lot of you were saying, wow, look at what this cool vendor can do. And many of you just kind of bumped into a vendor and ended up kind of licensing it. And now the appropriate question to ask is, okay, what truly differentiates this one vendor from the 35 other very plausible CDP vendors? Then obviously there's been a lot of excitement and hype here as elsewhere in the MarTech stack around AI and ML, but I think now the question that's being answered is, is the data in my CDP, which might not be the full superset of data that I have, is that really the right data set to model against? And what about our other modeling services within the enterprise? Are we now kind of bringing in almost a competitive set of tooling here? Some CDPs will purport to personalize your website. This can be exciting, but the question, of course, that it bears asking is, what about our other personalization services that might be closer to our marketing and engagement capabilities and staff and people? CDPs can often generate very nifty reports, but the other question that's asked is, we do have this separate business intelligence capability potentially within our enterprise. Is the CDP really acting on all of the data? Is it really giving us relevant reports, or is it really hamstrung by how much data it really has access to? Many CDPs will also send messages for you, often in an automated triggering way. But the question that many of you are asking us is, do we really want yet another messaging platform? Then what we heard this very often during the CDP 1.0 phase, hey, this works for me as a marketer, I'm going to go get it as a marketing platform. But now the question is getting asked as we are accelerating a lot of our customer-centric strategies during this time of pandemic is, what about our other customer touch points beyond marketing? Aren't those important as well? The other thing that we saw in 1.0 is a lot of excitement over demos about how easy it was to create basic segments. So I didn't need some data scientist to go do this for me as a marketer. I could just self-service some audiences and segments. Great. But what's often then we're running into is some of these platforms are actually quite limited in terms of the way that they can build segments. And in some cases, some of you who adopted early stage CDPs are now finding you have to do advanced segment building outside of the CDP because it can't handle certain capabilities. And certainly some of the capabilities revolve around this last one, which is, supports maybe in your initial data model, but it doesn't really support your full customer data model, which may need to account for households, products, channels, businesses, any number of other information entities that need to be used and deployed and leveraged as first-class data objects. And maybe your CDP can do that, maybe it can't. So a couple things about this. First is, we've been advising literally dozens of enterprises on CDP selection this year, and the interesting thing is I would say about half of them are replacement projects. So this isn't unusual, again, in new technology spaces, so we might have expected this, but I find it very interesting that, about half of the enterprises we're advising our CDPs are new to them, and the other half are literally replacing, having realized that the platform that they acquired turned out to be a poor fit for them. And one of the ways, as you notice what's underneath a lot of these questions, one of the key considerations here is around architecture. So to that extent, let's talk about scope. And there's a couple ways that I'm going to approach this from a scope perspective. First is kind of vertical scope. So where should a CDP sit in your stack with respect to your overall data management and engagement? And the second is more kind of horizontal scope. Where should a CDP sit relative to some of the adjacent tool sets and some of the activation capabilities that might be in play, and what should render onto the CDP and what shouldn't? Let's talk about data services first. This is a really interesting one, and I think it's going to be germane for all of you at some level. So here's what we sort of describe as CDP 1.0, and many of you have seen this diagram from us before, seen similar diagrams from others, which is that you have the CDP, it's ingesting first-party customer data, potentially second and third-party data, and then it's providing a number of different services there, including some data processing and management, segmentation, and then it activates that data across all these diverse channels and then gives you this kind of localized analytics. Okay, so this was really a 1.0 version, which was the customer data platform itself, or the CDP, was essentially the mixing bowl for all of your customer data, and this is where you did all of your customer data management. Now, it turns out that this is not a bad model if you are like a startup or you're a digital native firm, or your enterprise data services are not aligned with marketing, and so you don't have access to some of these capabilities, or you have enterprise data services and they're doing other tasks within your enterprise and are not available to manage your customer data. But if you already have enterprise data services around your customer data, then a CDP can be very duplicative. And so this is an issue around where it fits in. The way that we tend to divide this as analysts is to look at this from a services perspective. So there's a lot going on here. I'm just going to summarize this. You'll get the deck later and can get into the details. But basically what we're doing here is we're dividing the world into the customer data services world into two rough categories. One is in the green, what we call core data management, where you're building a pipeline of customer data. So you're ingesting that data from diverse sources, you're cleaning it, normalizing it, transforming it, you're integrating it, resolving identities really quickly, really important, ideally unifying that data, you're enriching it via external sources, filtering, aggregating, computing, you're applying compliance, privacy, and audit functions, you're reporting and analyzing and modeling. So all of this fairly sophisticated stuff, and then ideally you're distributing it to a data mart where it can then become accessible for marketers and other engagement people. Then there's data activation services, which we're dividing out into a separate category here, and I'll explain why, but this is sort of where the engagement people take over, and you create self-service audiences, you apply triggers, rules, or even orchestration. A lot of diversity there in terms of potential capabilities. You're distributing to multiple engagement channels, so that should be table stakes for any CDP, potentially generating localized reports. And then potentially, depending on the CDP, then getting into more sort of real-time decisioning and real-time personalization. So I'll just put a line here because not everyone would want that out of their CDP. This gets to a little bit of the horizontal differentiation that I'll get into later. But the key thing about this is that many of you already have the capability or the opportunity or already kind of building a pipeline of customer data. And so what you might need then from a CDP is just activation capabilities. On the other hand, some of you may not have access to these core data management capabilities elsewhere in your enterprise, or to the extent that they exist, they're not available to you or your particular group as marketing and engagement people. So you need to get these sort of services yourself in a more kind of full cycle customer data platform. And so this is a really important bifurcation in the marketplace, because some vendors purport to provide both of these sets of capabilities, and others limit themselves to just certain types of services. Now, these are nice, neat lines, because this is what analyst firms like Real Story Group tend to do. And the reality is, what we've seen across all of our clients is this is a little bit messier. In other words, I might need some of these capabilities in purple, but then I need one or two capabilities in green as well. Like I might need to do a little bit of compute, or I might need to resolve some identities and other things. Certainly vendors, even those who focus on data activation, are all going to get excited about this second row to the bottom in the green, report, analyze, and model, because they all want to get you excited about their AI and ML capabilities, even though very often those capabilities duplicate or replicate what you already have within the enterprise. So it's really important to understand from a services capability, what are we looking for from the CDP, and what already exists in our enterprise data fabric that we wouldn't ask the CDP vendor to do. This is particularly critical because sometimes vendors bundle these things together, and sometimes they break out different services in a way that you can purchase them sort of optionally. This also has some operational considerations. So, on the management side, you're really talking about a different set of roles: integration specialists, data engineers, data scientists. Whereas in the activation capabilities, you need, it's a more sort of marketing-oriented or engagement-oriented set of professionals. Still people who have to be comfortable working with data, but it's often, for that matter, often different interfaces, and even vendors that purport to do both sides of this equation will often even have separate platforms that do that for you. So I think this is pretty well recognized that these are different domains, and the question is, what do you want to render onto the CDP or not? This plays out in the real world in terms of the way that vendors have architected their platform. So let's take a look at the latest architecture diagram from Adobe, who has the Adobe Experience Platform. And this is definitely a full cycle platform. It wants to ingest sources from various places and then do quite a bit of data processing against that here in the red, as well as reporting. There's a data lake, there's data warehouses, there's a variety of query and AI systems and machine learning. And then the CDP in their world is really the activation part is kind of bolted on top along with some other optional SKUs. So you can't really buy an activation CDP from Adobe without also getting the core data management pipeline capabilities. This is a little bit of a surprise that we found among some longtime Adobe licensees who really just wanted a simpler activation-oriented CDP, and that's not actually what you're getting from Adobe. So I don't mean to pick on Adobe here. There's definitely a case for this particular architecture. It just has to be a good match for you, and if it's not a good match for you, then maybe Adobe isn't the right partner. So in CDP 2.0, for many of you, there's already an enterprise data fabric that's doing a lot of this core processing and then providing a pipeline to a customer data activation platform. And so the question is, in that box in the middle, where I've got two boxes, for some of you, those are going to be two distinct environments, certainly managed by two different people, two different sets of personas within your enterprise, two different roles, maybe even two different organizational units within your enterprise. And then for some of you, you see this as more of a joint activity, something that you would be very comfortable with having in a single platform, in which case you would want one of the more data management oriented CDPs that combines both of these. So that's the first kind of key master consideration with respect to scope, which is what are the data management services that you want in a CDP, and what are the data management services that you don't want in a CDP. And again, what we've done here is create these nice, neat boxes. In our work with dozens of enterprises this year around CDPs, we found that the boxes are not always that neat, and that's okay. It's a question of just kind of figuring out what's most important in your environment and crafting the right solution. I'll just remind you that if you have any questions or concerns, anything that you disagree with, anything that you want to agree with or share, feel free to use the GoToWebinar questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, where you can ask any question that you want. That goes just straight to me, and at the end, so you're not sharing it with anyone else, completely private. And then at the end, we'll answer your questions. All right, let's talk about the second set of architectural considerations here with respect to your stack. And it's really around engagement services, or more kind of lateral considerations, which is how, not just how deep do I want my CDP to go in my whole data architecture, but how wide do I want it to go with respect to some adjacent services or some engagement services that I may or may not want to subsume within my CDP. So a couple things to say about this. First of all, you need to be aware of other platforms that are trying to hold your definitive customer data. So this is one look at it, which is that there are a number of non-CDP vendors who claim that they can be a single source of truth for your customer data. So we sometimes see this in the advertising stack on the upper left, where you'll have DMPs that say that they're a CDP, or even sometimes DSPs that will say, hey, we're a CDP, and I can tell you they're not. We see sometimes CRM platforms who say, well, we can be a CDP. We've got all of your customer data. Salesforce, for the longest time, was making this argument. It's a totally ridiculous argument because you really do not want to trap your customer data just within your CRM environment. You see email and marketing automation platforms that say, well, we can be your CDP. And for B2B marketing automation platforms, it's not an implausible thing to say, because for a long time they have been your customer data mart. They're typically not particularly large, and you may not need an external CDP. So it's not always an implausible thing to say. What is implausible is a web content management vendor saying that they can be a CDP for you, and that's completely absurd. You never want to trap your customer data just within a web environment. So you've got vendors like Sitecore and Episerver, to a lesser extent, Acquia, that are saying that they do this and that this is the best practice, and I can tell you straight out it's a worse practice. As we go down this sort of stack here, sometimes you'll see journey orchestration engines who want to be very close to your segments, who say, well, we can also provide segmentation. So a good example of that might be some of the older campaign management solutions like Unica will say, okay, we can do your decisioning, but we'll also manage your segments for you. Generally speaking, that's not really the right place to do it. Now, different intelligence hubs that are part of this lower data fabric that I was talking about sometimes say, well, we could be your CDP as well. The thing you need to understand about this is going to be a homegrown CDP, and likely is not going to have particularly good connector frameworks, and it's probably not going to be very marketer friendly. So at that point, you're kind of building your own CDP. And then occasionally you'll see customer and identity management systems say that they can be a CDP. You just extend the profile data set. You never, ever, ever want to do that. So if you're serious about this, you probably want to, and you want to license customer data platform, I would argue you should go out and license best of breed customer data platform technology and make the other systems integrate with it, as opposed to taking something that you already have off the shelf and turn it into a CDP. But now here's the more interesting question that we're going to get at in this part of the half hour, which is CDP vendors can say that they can do certain capabilities, and the question that you have is, do I really want them to be performing these capabilities? So again, starting in the upper left, you have vendors, CDP vendors, who say that they can functionally serve as your DMP. That's kind of sort of true. The thing that, of course, that they're not doing is necessarily sharing data. CDPs can generate audiences for DSPs, for social networks, to even push to your DMP or wherever environment where you may be then doing onboarding. But that's usually the extent of it. On the yellow box here on email marketing automation, more and more CDP vendors are saying they can do this. We tend to be very skeptical about this when it's not clear that they can really do this at scale, nor do you necessarily want another messaging platform. I also see CDP vendors who claim that they can do some degree of web content management, particularly around things like lead generation forms and landing pages and other sorts of things, because they can personalize those experiences very natively. And at that point, then they'll do things like scrape your content or get the content from your CMS and assemble and generate these pages. And the question I have is, do you really want your CDP to be doing this or not? Particularly if you have other capabilities that can do it that are closer to your marketing and CX teams. With respect to journey orchestration, many CDP vendors now starting to get into this. That is an interesting kind of innovation in an area you might want to explore, because journey orchestration engines are very complex. The operational needs around them are intense. Maybe you can kind of put your toes into the water a little bit with some CDPs, and maybe that's not a bad thing. just don't get oversold here, because you're probably more likely to need more simple rules and decisions and triggering as opposed to full-scale orchestration. And then, as we mentioned below, there are some CDP vendors who can claim that they could be your entire kind of full-stack data fabric intelligence hubs here in the blue, that they can do all the data processing, the analytics, the reporting and visualization, the predictive modeling, the dashboards. They can do it all. And at that point, you have to ask, do I really want this from my CDP vendor, or do I have more fit for purpose, probably more robust platforms already in my ecosystem, my own internal data ecosystem, that can and should provide these services for me? Now, part of what this relates to is, of course, whenever you mention marketing suite, there are a collection of large vendors out there who will purport to do a lot of these things, and therefore you should get a CDP from them. I picked on Adobe a minute ago. I'll pick on Salesforce here. Salesforce, of course, argues that you'll have a much more integrated stack if you simply license all these different Salesforce modules. I'm here to tell you that for most of you, this is a really bad sort of strategy, because what you really want is fit for purpose. And all of these are various, calliope, or of some cases a catastrophe of mix and match tool sets. Salesforce, as many of you know, acquired a CDP vendor called Evergage, which they're now trying to integrate into their platform. And Evergage has some really significant functional problems. And so just because it's Salesforce doesn't mean it's going to be a good match for you. Similar issue, by the way, with Acquia. Acquia acquired a retail-oriented, Acquia is the big, Drupal kind of mega cloud vendor. They acquired a retail-oriented CDP, and they are selling this now as kind of a general purpose CDP. It is not a general purpose CDP. It's probably a bad fit for 95% of the Acquia customers. So it's another example of being really careful about not selecting a CDP just because you have some other adjacent tools from that vendor. So let's look really quickly at marketplace considerations and how to select. We've got a whole series of webinars on this. You can go back and see some of those recorded webinars that are publicly available. You know that this is a highly fragmented marketplace. That's probably why you came here today. You heard our skepticism at Real Story Group about some of the suite vendors. A lot of choices on the pure play platforms. One of the interesting things about these vendors is that on the surface they may look very similar. Once you dig into the details, as we have, you'll notice that there's really substantial differences among them, both with respect to the scope, the vertical scope, the horizontal scope we talked about, and also just not just what they do, but how they do it. And we've been always big believers at Real Story Group that how a vendor does something is usually the most differentiating capabilities. This is another way of looking at the marketplace. Again, this bifurcation between, on the one hand, primarily those that are focused on activation and those that are focused more on core data management and pipeline building on the one hand, or primarily data analytics on the right. I'm not going to argue that this is a really scientific approach here, so you shouldn't use this to build a short list. This is more our kind of off-the-cuff clustering. We're constantly moving these around as we learn more and as the vendors evolve. But this is kind of a shorthand for sort of showing that different vendors have different emphases here. But when you're selecting CDPs, you always want to do it relative to business use cases. So in our own vendor evaluation research, these are the 10 use cases that we evaluate vendors against. And I won't get into all the details here. You can see this in some of the free samples that are available on our website. But I will say that the typical CDP vendor typically excels at only 3, maybe 4 of these things, is pretty poor at 3 or 4 others, and then kind of sort of addresses 2 others. So you need to be, one of the ways that you want to filter here is to really understand what are our priorities. Nominally, you might want to do all this stuff, but really you want to ask what are our priorities, and then try to match up against the right CDPs. And clearly our research can help you there as well. So here are some key takeaways. First, don't purchase a CDP until you figure out where it will sit in your overall stack. The data management scope will quickly narrow your choices. The good news is there's still so many vendors that once you've narrowed your choices, you're still going to have probably 8 or 9 plausible possibilities. You definitely want to evaluate service scope carefully to avoid unnecessary duplication. This is a really important one. We've been gathering this council of enterprise stack leaders for these private sessions where they're kind of advising each other, and it's been fascinating hosting these council meetings. And one of the things that they've been mentioning is during this current pandemic crisis that there's a lot of pressure on them to kind of deduplicate their stack. In other words, where do we have duplicate overlapping services? And so I think this is now more than ever, you want to make sure that your CDP is not somehow overlapping or replicating things that you can already do. Beware of mindlessly selecting CDPs from suite vendors. In many cases, it's going to be a very poor match for you. But the larger story here, obviously, is do your research, right? There's 35 or more plausible CDP vendors around the world. This is, obviously, I'm going to say this because we sell research and advisory and consulting services for a living. Whether you use Real Story Group or not, make sure that you do really close research. And then if you do decide to go into a selection process, always follow a use case empirical test-based selection process rather than just take the vendor's word for it. So on the surface, they all look very similar. You really got to get under the covers to understand how they're different, and then really figure out, okay, it's going to be a good fit for my stack or not. So a lot of questions have come in. There's still time to ask some others. I'm going to have a look at these while Scott tells you a little bit more about next steps here.
Great, thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, we do have detailed research on a number of the CDP providers that are out there. So what you can do is actually download a sample from that research at no cost. So go to realstorygroup.com/try, and you can download a sample. But also, I do want to mention the fact that there are really 3 different ways in which you can gain expertise from Tony and the rest of the analysts here at Real Story Group. You can purchase the research on the CDP marketplace in a self-service type of capacity. We also offer advisory services beyond that arrangement. So you can get a select number of advisory hours for whether it's a CDP project, or if you're looking at a broader scope of technologies. We also offer a stack advisory package where you would have access to all of our research and be able to get more hours to really define your MarTech stack and where a CDP or where other products would fit in there. And as Tony mentioned, we have a leadership council that we would invite you to explore that really allows you to join a network of industry peers, tech stack leaders in a confidential, vendor-free environment. We meet 3 to 4 times per year. And actually the topic of our next meeting will be around customer data management. So certainly reach out to us at explore@realstorygroup.com if any of those services could be helpful for you in your quest to find the right customer data platform for your needs. And I do want to turn things back over to Tony, as a number of questions have come in. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Really excited about that next council meeting. We're bringing together stack owners to privately share their experiences. We're going to do a lot of interesting show and tell on customer data management. I'm excited about that. But any questions from you folks out in the audience? So Michelle's asking, you mentioned half of your enterprise engagements are for CDP replacement projects. Are there common themes across these when it comes to why it's falling short? I wouldn't say there's a lot of common themes. It's a number of things that you would expect when people buy early in a marketplace, which is that they didn't really realize what they were buying, and it turned out to be a poor fit, either with respect to data model, with respect to services mismatch, with respect to a mismatch between the roles of the people that the enterprise have and the types of capabilities that you need to actually master the platform. One of the interesting things that we find is even just the segmenting interface, which varies dramatically from vendor to vendor. Some are easier to use than others, and a lot of it depends on how complex your segments are. So there's a whole set of issues, Michelle, why this 1.0 leap into the pool might have been the wrong pool to jump into. So James is asking, what are the trade-offs of me requiring my CDP to serve as a one-stop shop and fulfill all the roles across data management, analytics, orchestration, personalization, and final mile delivery? Can a CDP be great at all of them? No, the CDP cannot be great at all of them. I think that's one of the key findings of our research, James, is that those that tend to be more focused on activation and in fact getting closer to the customer, generally speaking, the less they offer with respect to core data management and pipeline assembly, and vice versa. So although vendors will tell you that they can do it all, the reality is that they can't, and you need to really think about what are the key capabilities that I need, and then where am I going to backfill? Of course, this, as always, this question depends on the size of your enterprise. If you're a small or mid-sized enterprise, maybe a kind of all-in-one package would work for you. For larger enterprises, typically we counsel that organizations focus. And for that matter, we have seen large enterprises who quite credibly and with very good reasons have 2 CDPs. I'm not saying that everybody should do this as a prescription, but it's out there and there's a reason for that. Zachary is saying that Acquia acquired a CDP, so they're not a CMS trying to be a CDP, but rather a DXP company with a CXP component. Yeah, so first of all, I don't really believe in DXPs. They don't actually exist. But Acquia, and for that matter, Salesforce, and for that matter, Acoustic and Oracle and others, who they acquired a CDP, that doesn't mean A, that it's particularly well integrated, and P, that CDP is going to be a good fit for you. And I think particularly Acquia, who acquired a very, very niche CDP, is unlikely to be a good fit for a substantial part of their customer base. Vincent is asking, build versus buy. You touched on it briefly, but what should be considered when the question comes up? I don't think that CDP brings anything special in terms of build versus buy as any other kind of technology, except to say that we would tend to argue you should not build because there's this whole wide spectrum of 35 plausible vendors out there. Why would you want to build your own? The other thing that is always been the case in MarTech is you probably are going to be building some capabilities around it. In other words, there's the build versus buy is not completely binary for many people. For almost all of you, you're going to be somewhere in between. It's just a question of how much have you bought and then what do you have to build around it. So, for example, we see very often where I have an activation-oriented CDP, but it's ingesting models that I've built in a custom way in a data lake, where I brought my own AI capabilities, I brought separate ML capabilities, I built my own data lake. I've got all my data there. I don't want all my data in the CDP. CDP should never be a data lake. So I have a separate data lake that I built. It's generating models. I'm exporting the output from those pre-computed models into my CDP. So it's a great example where I bought a CDP and then I built a modeling infrastructure. James is asking, how long and how much would it cost for me to do this in-house? Okay, same answer, James. Don't do it in-house unless you absolutely have to. Is there a business case for a CDP and an advertiser who's heavily invested in the Google stack, like Google Marketing Platform, GCP, Analytics, BigQuery, so on and so forth? Yeah, I mean, I don't think it matters so much. I mean, there's 2 questions here. One is, as an advertiser, do you need one? And the answer may well be yes. And then the question is, okay, I've already invested in all these Google cloud, you and everybody else. Look, everybody has some investment in some cloud and certain capabilities. So as it happens, many CDP vendors use GCP or are built on top of the Google Cloud, but at some level that doesn't even matter. I go back to this, Michael, to this question of services. What services do you need from a CDP? And then even if that CDP happens to be built in the Amazon environment, it kind of doesn't matter. It's going to be interacting with your other data services that happen to be built within Google. Florian is asking, if you already have a heavy tech stack investment with a marketing cloud, Adobe, Salesforce, why would you consider a different vendor to go for a CDP? Probably because the Adobe CDP is going to be really, first of all, a very heavyweight platform, and secondly, functionally, probably a very poor fit for you with respect to the kind of data services that it wants to bring. And so a more best-of-breed CDP might be a much lighter, faster, cheaper, easier, more functional, less duplicative capability in your market, I mean, in your stack. Same thing for Salesforce. Salesforce has acquired this platform, Evergage, but they have a lot of other customer data capabilities outside of Evergage. They're trying to sell you an entire suite of capabilities. If Evergage fits neatly into that, that's great. But there are functional issues with the Adobe CDP and with the Evergage CDP. They have some significant functional problems that could prove prohibitive for you. So you can't just assume that a large vendor has your best interests at heart. They do not have your best interests at heart. They just want to cross-sell you as many tools as possible for maximum lock-in. You have to own your stack. Don't let Salesforce, don't let Adobe, don't let Acoustic, don't let Oracle, don't let SAP, don't let a vendor own your stack. You own your stack. You may have some anchors in that stack from Salesforce and Adobe, but you make the key decision for the right fit for your marketers, because at the end of the day, they have to be effective. Okay, so with that, we've exceeded our time a little bit, but I hope you found this useful. Feel free to reach out to us at any time if you have further questions or you'd like to understand how we could help you make more effective decisions around customer data management, or for that matter, your entire stack. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne, signing off until next time. Bye now.